Likewise, they consider me to be upon a deviant creed, and I accept at least the honesty, but I don't accept the kumbaya mentality from people who are claiming to be Atharis or Hanbalis or Salafis in Aqidah, and those who are claiming to be Ash'aris and Maturidis in Aqidah, who say, no, these are not fundamental differences, just stick to the 6 pillars of Iman. The 6 pillars of Iman, according to whose understanding? According to the understanding of us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah? According to the Mu'tazila? According to the philosophers? According to who? Today I have a very important episode for you guys. Usually I say interesting or exciting. I hope that this is interesting for a lot of people, but this is probably one of the most important videos that I've ever made on my YouTube channel. That's from my perspective, from what I believe is correct from the Quran and Sunnah. But nevertheless, I hope that by watching this video, I will convince at least some of you to see the importance of the topic of Aqidah. And today we will be discussing who actually is al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Who are the true Sunnis? Is it Ash'aris? Is it Maturidis? Is it Ash'aris and Maturidis? Is it Ash'aris, Maturidis, and what we would call Atharis or Salafis? Is there a difference between the so-called Atharis of Imam Ahmad, following him, and Ibn Taymiyyah? Is there a big difference between the Atharis of the past and the Salafis of today? These are some questions that I'm going to get into, but the most important question that I'm going to indulge in is who are or who is al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah according to both sides who claim to be the true Sunnis on the Aqidah of the Salaf, on the Aqidah or on the beliefs of the pious predecessors of the first 3 generations of Muslims. Some people may have seen recently there's been some discussions about this. Well, it's actually all 3 sects, quote unquote, or all 3 schools of theology, the Ash'aris, the Maturidis, and the Atharis Salafis. They're all part of al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. I'm going to be investigating as to whether or not that answer is accurate, and also, are there significant differences in Aqidah amongst these 3 different schools? Or are they just minor ikhtilafi matters, kind of like the schools of fiqh? You know, like, is the Ash'ari position and the Salafi position on the other side, is it like Maliki and Hanafi or Shafi'i and Hanbali? Are the differences sort of minor ikhtilafi matters that we can just say, oh, well, there's a difference of opinion, and hey, we think the other school is wrong, but the other opinion that they hold is not a deviant position. It's just what we would say is incorrect, or from our own ijtihad, from our own reasoning and intellectual faculties, we would say, we think it's incorrect, but it's not a deviant position. I'm going to demonstrate, hopefully for the audience to see today, that the differences between these 3 schools are not just minor ikhtilafi matters like the schools of fiqh, and they have never been viewed that way from either side, from the side of the Mutakallimun, whether it be the Ash'aris, the Maturidis, or even the Mu'tazila on one side, and the Atharis or Salafis on the other side. Those on both sides, they've criticized each other strongly and have considered their positions in terms of their creed to be deviant, and sometimes even positions rising to the level of kufr. What I want to say from the outset, though, before I go into this any further, I am not making takfir or mass takfir on the Ash'aris and Maturidis. That is not a position that I hold. The position that I hold is that in terms of the Aqidah, in terms of their creedal beliefs, some of them are the same positions of al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, which is the Athari position, or Ahl al-Hadith, or the Salafis, going by different names. But on several key issues, they hold deviant positions of bid'ah. That doesn't even mean that I consider all of the people who are walking around today who call themselves Ash'aris or Maturidis to be deviants themselves, because they can hold a deviant position without actually being deviants. And why do I say that is because from my general experience, the majority of so-called card-carrying Ash'aris or Maturidis are largely ignorant of the matters that I'm about to discuss. They don't even really understand their creed very well. They just know that they're supposed to say, I'm an Ash'ari or I'm a Maturidi, but they don't really understand the lawazim or the entailments of their position and what that entails. So obviously, they need to be spoken to. We need to give them dawah and so on and so forth. People have made a lot to do about this discussion, and so let's just jump straight into this because I'm going to go into significant detail. I don't want to cover this in a very very surface level manner, I'm going to show you that on both sides of the aisle, on the Ash'ari Maturidi side and on the Salafi Athari side, we have considered each other's creedal positions to be deviant, and that's clear from the scholarly sources. What's interesting, and ironically enough, you don't really see this kumbaya type of Ash'ari thing until actually post-Enlightenment period, or actually much later on in the Islamic tradition. You don't see that earlier on at the time of Imam Ahmed or shortly after that. You don't see that this sort of kumbaya with the Mu'tazila and the Ash'aris and the Maturidis and the Hanabila or us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Oh yeah, it's all basically very similar, the same thing. There's only minor differences, and those minor differences we don't really have to worry about too much. No, this was never the idea. We don't see this until much later on, until the past maybe couple hundred years. So what's interesting is, ironically enough, this is a product of liberalism. I would say it's a liberalist understanding of Aqidah, but nevertheless, that's what it is. And I think it's very important for us to explain why this is wrong and why the topic of Aqidah is so important. So anyway, that's the intro. Let's jump straight into this. Yes, it's going to be lengthy, but if you actually are sincere and want to understand these issues on a deeper level, then I think you'll invest the time at listening to this presentation. Let's start off with the first question. Who is or who are us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah? Now, this is from Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, who many people in the audience would not accept, but that's fine. But I'm going to show you from the other side of them basically saying the same thing. Now, some of this discussion has happened in the recent past regarding Sunnis and Shia and so on and so forth. There are multiple ways in which the term Ahl-Sunnah could be understood. So Shaykh al-Islam is going to explain the two different ways and give an answer as to how we should understand it. So he says in Minhaj as-Sunnah, the term Ahl-Sunnah can refer to those who affirm the caliphate of the first three caliphs, which includes all sects except the Rafida Shia. So yeah, if you affirm the genuineness of the first three Khalifas, Abu Bakr, Umar and Uthman radiyallahu anhum, if you understand that they were genuine Khalifas and that they had the right to rule and you don't disrespect them, then broadly speaking, you can be considered part of Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So it's one way you can understand it is Ahl-Sunnah is a term that differentiates between those who accept and respect the companions and those who rejected their authority. And then he says, however, it can also specifically refer to Ahl al-Hadith and the pure Sunnah, in which case it only includes those who affirm the divine attributes of Allah, believe that the Quran is uncreated, that Allah will be seen in the hereafter, affirm the divine decree, and adhere to other fundamental principles known among the Ahl al-Hadith and the Sunnah. So he says, in one sense, Ahl al-Sunnah can refer to, broadly speaking, the Ash'aris, the Maturidis, Ahl al-Hadith, or even the Mu'tazila. In some sense, Ahl al-Sunnah can be used in a broad category to refer to anyone who actually respects the authority of the Sahaba and the first three Khalifas. On the other hand, more specifically, Ahl-Sunnah refers to Ahl al-Hadith or the Athariyah, those who actually affirm the principles genuinely and fully of the Quran wa Sunnah, which excludes the Mutakallimun or the Ash'aris, Maturidis, and the Mu'tazila. Okay, now let me just show you an example of how the Mutakallimun actually disrespected the scholars of Ahl al-Hadith. This is from al-Khatib al-Baghdadi, where he says, what? As for the Mutakallimun, they are excused for the disdain they display towards the scholars of Hadith. So they're known for having a disdain for the scholars of Hadith and the criticisms they levy against them. This is due to the significant differences between them, which provoke mutual hostility and discord. The Mutakallimun believe that much of what the Hadith scholars transmit and circulate is false, and they consider those who authenticate these transmissions as disbelievers and fabricators. They label the Hadith scholars the Hashawiyah, which is a derogatory term. The opinion of the Hadith scholars regarding the Mutakallimun is also well known to both scholars and students. As it was said, quote, Allah knows that we do not love you, and we do not blame you for not loving us. So you can see from al-Khatib al-Baghdadi that he clearly is showing the animosity and dislike from the scholars of Hadith and the Mutakallimun. The Mutakallimun disrespect the scholars, and I'll show that in much more detail. Even scholars like Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim and so on and so forth, you will see them actually by name disrespecting them, and they consider them wrong for transmitting transmitting many things, and at times would consider them fabricators and even disbelievers, and use such derogatory terms to refer to the scholars of Hadith as what? The Hashawiyya, which is a derogatory term used to refer to us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. Then, of course, the scholars of Hadith in kind return that and says, look, Allah knows that we do not love you, and we don't blame you for not loving us because we have these differences that are very strong, right? So we see how the classical scholars are actually dealing with this. These aren't just minor matters of ikhtilaf. And for those who are claiming that, and at the same time are claiming to be Atharis or claiming to be Salafis, Ibn Taymiyyah rebukes you and says, no, these are not minor differences of ikhtilaf, and that we shouldn't be speaking out against the people of deviance, or we shouldn't be speaking out against the Ash'aris and Maturidis. No, it's a very important issue that should be spoken out against. And now, this doesn't mean that we only need to talk about these issues. We can talk about other main issues that are affecting Ummah, like Zionism, like liberalism, like secularism, and all these other atheism and all these harmful isms. We can refute all of them and also put forward the Aqidah of Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So, Ibn Taymiyyah talks about the importance of refuting the deviants. And what does he say? He says, as for the leaders of innovation, those whose statements contradict the Quran and Sunnah, or whose practices deviate from the Quran and Sunnah, exposing their reality and warning the Ummah against them is an obligation agreed upon by the Muslims. It was even said to Ahmad ibn Hanbal, meaning Imam Ahmad, of course, quote, a man fasts, prays, and observes i'tikaf. Is that more beloved to you, or that he speaks against people of innovation? So Imam Ahmad is being asked, what is more beloved to you? Someone who speaks against the deviants, those who are upon bid'ah, speaks against that, or those who pray much and fast much and are known for their ibadah and so on and so forth? Imam Ahmad replies, if he fasts, prays, and observes i'tikaf, it is for himself. But if he speaks against the people of innovation, it is for the Muslims. This is better. So he's comparing somebody who's just sticking to himself, focusing on his ibadah, which is very important, versus someone who is actually very diligent in refuting the innovators. And Imam Ahmad says, refuting those of innovation is actually more beloved to him. It's better. Why? Because that is in service to all of the Muslims, while the individual aspects of worship are only of the benefit of the believer himself. Then further on, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah says, again, in contrast to these baseless takfiris, some who do not fully understand the beliefs of Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, well, I think many of these people fall under that category that have been discussing these issues lately, or they understand some aspects while remaining ignorant of others. Exactly what is true. What they do know, they might not communicate clearly to the people. Exactly, we've had trouble getting them clearly to communicate their beliefs to the community. Instead, they conceal it and do not oppose the innovations that contradict the Quran, the Sunnah, and consensus, nor do they censure or punish the innovators. Exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing this kumbaya type of mentality. Oh no, it's no problem. You know, these are just minor matters of ikhtilaf. We don't have to speak against these people. We don't have to clearly communicate our aqidah. We could just say we affirm the 6 pillars of Iman, and that's it. Even though all of the innovators and even many of the kuffar claim to affirm the 6 pillars of Iman. But it's when you ask and go into even the minutest amount of detail on those issues, like the Mu'tazila, like the Falasifa, we see that they give lip service to the 6 pillars of Iman, but in terms of the basic foundational details, they reject it. And this is the same for many of the deviant groups. They might even condemn speaking about the Sunnah and the fundamentals of religion indiscriminately, failing to differentiate between what the Quran, the Sunnah, and consensus indicate and what the people of innovation and division claim. So they accuse someone like me of dividing the Ummah at a time where we need to be united. And yes, we can unite, but we unite on the haqq. We unite on the truth, not upon batil or falsehood. And also, Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah, who's someone throughout his scholarly career, is someone who was strong against the innovators, wrote many books condemning and refuting them, but at the time, when it was time to do jihad fi sabilillah, he had no problem standing side by some Ash'aris or Maturidis. So we can unite on the things that genuinely we should unite upon, where we genuinely agree and upon truth, but we are not going to unite upon falsehood, and we are not going to say, oh, these are just minor matters, they're not fundamentals of the religion. No, Shaykh al-Islam al-Islam is saying they are fundamentals of religion. And these same people who say they're not, they even try to censure people like me who's speaking about these fundamentals of religion, speaking about the Quran and Sunnah, and speaking against the innovators. So this is nothing new. This is something that people have been doing for a little while now, and people on the fringes do this, and we're always spoken out against, right? Then Shaykh al-Islam says, they may also allow differing views to persist as if they are permissible areas of scholarly debate. Exactly what we've been saying. As if they're just minor matters of ikhtilaf. This approach often dominates many of those who are guilty of irja, some jurists, Sufis, and philosophers, just as the former approach dominates many of the people of whims and mutakallimun. Both of these methods deviate from the Quran and the Sunnah. What is obligatory is to clarify what Allah has sent with His messengers and revealed to His books, to convey what the messengers have brought from Allah, and to fulfill the covenant that Allah has taken from the scholars. It is essential to know what the messengers have brought, believe in it, convey it, and call to it. This is not something that we easily want to make takfir over on one side. On the other hand, it's not something that we just want to be hush-hush about and say, oh, these are just minor differences. We don't need to really speak about them. They're just matters of scholarly debate or just genuine ikhtilaf, like the differences amongst the rulings in fiqh between the Hanafis and the Malikis and the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis. Both positions are wrong. The correct position is to speak about the Quran wa Sunnah, to speak about the Aqidah of the Salaf wa Salih. And the middle path, which Shaykh al-Islam is claiming to represent, is that we do not easily make takfir over these issues. And on the other hand, we also speak about them. We speak and call to the creed of the Salaf Salih. We also speak about the deviations and throughout history that people have been upon and are on up until today. We also clarify these issues, and we say that people should be careful about these deviations, and we refute them. We should be very strong in that, and we should not be having this lax type of mentality. Just to show you that this is not just Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah, or this is just the position of the Atharis or the Salafis. No. We're going to see there are clear differences, because people are wondering, okay, Brother Jake, well, you're showing that the Mutakallimun and the Atharis or Salafis strongly disagreed in the past and would consider each other to be on deviant creeds. But what actually are these differences? Are there any differences that they were dealing with even up until today that would be concerning for us, and how do they have any effect on the average Muslim today? Okay, so let's go through this, and I'm going to establish this from both the side of the Mutakallimun admitting this and Ahl al-Hadith or us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So these are differences between al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah and the Ash'aris and Maturidis or the Mutakallimun in terms of methodology, in terms of basic fundamental methodology and interpretation of scripture. So Arazi, the huge Ash'ari scholar, says this, that if definitive rational proofs establish something and we then find scriptural evidence that appears to contradict it, the situation can be only one of four possibilities. So he's going over, what do we do when reason and revelation contradict each other? He says there's only four possibilities. What are they? Either both rational and scriptural evidence is accepted, which entails believing in two contradictories, meaning to believe in, okay, they contradict and we believe in both of them, that's contradictory. And this is impossible, which we would agree with. Or the apparent meanings of the scriptural texts are accepted and the rational proofs are rejected. So if you can't accept both of them because that would be contradictory, then what if you accept the scriptural text and reject the rational proofs? He says this is also invalid because we can only know the validity of the scriptural text through rational proofs that establish the existence of the Creator, His attributes, and the veracity of the miracles that prove the truthfulness of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Now, as we can see, what is the position of the Ash'aris and the Mutakallimun more generally is that if you have rational proofs, proofs that are known through reason alone, and then you have scriptural proofs or scriptural evidence, what do you do when they contradict? What does he say, and what is the position of the Mutakallimun? Very clearly, you take the rational proofs over scripture, and that's when they make tafweed of the scripture and say, oh, we just don't know the meaning, or they make ta'wil, where they say, oh, it doesn't really mean that. In order to absolve the contradiction, they say it means something else other than the apparent meaning of the text. This is not the methodology and understanding of al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. We say, the Atharis say, and Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah has an entire text written on this subject, refuting al-Razi and explaining what our position actually is, we say that the naql and the aql can never possibly contradict one another. So reason and revelation cannot possibly contradict each other. So to even say that, oh, what do we do when reason and revelation contradict each other is a false assumption to assume that they actually can genuinely contradict each other. No, they cannot. And we can understand how they cannot, but the problem with the mutakallimun is they have these pseudo-rational principles, which they got from pagan Greek philosophy and other sources that don't actually derive from the Quran wa Sunnah and from the statements of the early Salaf. They don't actually derive from that. They derive from outside sources, and they take those as foundational matters, these pseudo-rational principles. These principles then contradict the Quran and Sunnah, and then they have to mold the Quran and Sunnah to fitting their pseudo-rational principles. We say, no. Your pseudo-rational principles, they're not derived from the Quran and Sunnah. They contradict it, and they also contradict sound reason itself. So this is a clear difference and distinction in methodology in ways that we interpret the text. And for those who are concerned with liberalism, when you have this way of understanding the text, where you bring so-called pseudo-rational principles to the text of Scripture, this is what leads to ta'wil and this whole concept of the batiniya, and there's an inner meaning and an outer meaning. This is what then results in things like liberalism and secularism, and these even has effects, wide effects on fiqh matters. Because if you can make ta'wil of the texts that are revealed about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his names and attributes, then of course you can make ta'wil over fiqh matters. No problem. And when I'm talking about ta'wil, I'm talking about an interpretation of the text that is not based on the apparent meaning that is so far out there and contradicts everything else that we know. Now, some people may say, okay, but Jake, this is only al-Razi. No, this is not the case. So let's go to another scholar, as-Sunusi. What does he say? He says, as for those who claim that the path to knowing the truth starts with the book and the Sunnah, and that it is forbidden to rely on anything else, the refutation of this is that their evidence can only be known through rational inquiry. Furthermore, according to many scholars, there are apparent meanings in the scriptures that if taken on their apparent meaning would lead one to disbelief or heresy. Wow. So again, as-Sunusi is very clearly saying that those who want to stick to the Quran and Sunnah, this must be negated. Why? Because if you stick to the Quran and Sunnah based on its apparent meaning, based on what it obviously says or what it seems to obviously say, if you want to do that, it will lead to kufr and bid'ah. So it could lead to disbelief or heresy or deviation. Now, who are the people who actually want to stick to the Quran and Sunnah upon the apparent meaning? So I'm going over the foundational differences. The first foundational difference is how we are actually interpret scripture. Is it based on this understanding of these pseudo-rational principles that we go to the text with, or not? Do we say that reason and revelation cannot possibly contradict one another? The second important difference is the obligation upon the layman. Is there an obligation on the layman to study these intricate matters of aqidah and the so-called proofs for the existence of God from the mutakallimun? Well, the Ash'aris and the Maturidis and the mutakallimun say that yes, there is an obligation upon the layman to do that, where we say, no, there is no obligation. So for people who were criticizing me saying, oh, but Jake, you're making the layman want to go into all these intricate matters of aqidah. No, it's actually the opposite. It's the mutakallimun who say that the layman must go into these intricate matters of aqidah and kalam. Why? Because they believe that the common person, the lay person, is upon kufr. They're upon disbelief. Why? Because they have many positions that contradict what they call are these pseudo-rational principles. So they must learn the ways of the mutakallimun in order to be absolved of that. And they must establish the existence of God through these rational proofs, because if they don't, then they are not actually epistemically justified. They're not justified in their belief, in believing in God and believing in the Creator, unless they go through these complicated proofs of the mutakallimun. I'm going to show you an example of this from Abu Mansur al-Baghdadi, where he says, and I quote, according to us, the correct opinion is that the first obligation upon the mukallaf, the person who is responsible, is to engage in contemplation and inference that leads to knowledge of Allah, His attributes, His oneness, His justice, and His wisdom. Then comes the contemplation and the inference that leads to the permissibility of Allah sending messengers and assigning duties to His servants as He wills. Then the contemplation leads to the necessity of sending messengers and assigning duties. Then the contemplation leads to the details of the pillars of the Sharia. Finally, one must act upon what is obligatory according to its conditions. So these are all of the steps and the jumps and hoops and the ladders that the common layman has to climb in order to be justified in their belief. We, as the Atharis, as the Salafis of us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, we don't believe in this. Why? Because the Prophet ﷺ in the Quran says that actually general humanity is born upon the fitrah, which is to know that there is a creator that exists, to have that disposition to know that a creator exists. And there are several other things as well. And it's only their parents or society or friends and family members who actually deviate them away from the fitrah. And then at that point, we say, okay, at that point, sometimes we may actually need to use rational proofs or discussions and so on and so forth with those who have been deviated from the fitrah. When the fitrah has become clouded, we must sometimes remove those cobwebs. And there are different ways that can be done. And sometimes that is through rational arguments. However, that isn't the main way that this is done because we believe most of humanity is upon the fitrah. However, what we consider the fitrah to be and the beliefs that they're upon are what the Quran and Sunnah actually preach on their apparent meaning. And the mutakallimun would actually agree with that to the extent that the apparent meaning of the text is in line with the common lay Muslims believe, but many of those beliefs are kufr. And because of that, we need to make ta'wil of those texts and we need to teach them their intricate ways of kalam in order to get them off of this kufr. We say no. We teach them the basics of aqeedah. We don't have to go into these intricate matters of these different rational proofs and speaking about all the differences of the positions of the mutakallimun. And so we don't need to do all of that. Why? Because the common believer is already upon, for the most part, the correct beliefs. We teach them the basics of aqeedah. They don't need to go into intricate details about all of these convoluted jumps and hoops that the mutakallimun want them to go through, and they're fine. So this is another clear distinction. Now, Imam al-Nawawi, who there's been some debate about him recently, but on this issue specifically, and I'm not going to go into his aqeedah more generally, but on this issue specifically, very clearly from the outset, he rejects the Ash'ari position and the position of the mutakallimun. So on a fundamental matter, he takes our position, the position of us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. He says, the Prophet saying in another narration, I have been commanded to fight the people until they testify that there is no God but Allah and that they believe in me and what I have brought, provides clear evidence supporting the view of the majority of the Salaf. So he says our view, which he's going to describe, is the majority of the Salaf, not the position of the mutakallimun, and later scholars, that if a person firmly believes in Islam without any doubt, that is sufficient. And he is considered a believer among the monotheists of the people of Tawheed. He is not obligated to learn the mutakallimun's proofs and to know Allah through them. This contradicts those who insist that it is obligatory and a condition for being considered among the people of the Qibla, claiming that one cannot be deemed a Muslim without it. This view is held by many Mu'tazilites or the Mu'tazila and some of our mutakallimun, but it is evidently incorrect. So again, upon the obligation of the mukallaf, the person who has to go out and establish the existence of God through these proofs of the mutakallimun, what? An-Nawawi clearly rejects that and says, no, actually the correct position of the Salaf is that if he truly believes in Islam, there's no problem with it whatsoever. He is justified in his belief. We consider him a Muslim, and the position of the mutakallimun is incorrect. So we've already seen in two fundamental matters what justifies your belief in Islam, whether you're a Muslim or not, and how do we interpret scripture, and what do we do when reason and revelation contradict each other. These are fundamental matters of aqeedah, which are still relevant for us today. And I showed, or I gave a hint at one example of how ta'wil and this practice of ta'wil and the batiniyah actually can lead to significant issues when it comes to even matters of fiqh and interpreting things wildly. We'll see here from another Ash'ari scholar, as-Subki, where he calls al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah those who interpret the text according to the apparent meaning, right? Which is what Arazi said we must negate because it leads to kufr. And the same thing as-Subki is going to say, and most of the the Ash'aris say is that the apparent meaning of the text of the Quran and Sunnah can lead to kufr and shirk. Therefore, we must negate it and make ta'wil of it. So, as-Subki says, the greatest calamity and the most grievous disaster is to pass over the apparent meaning of the texts and to believe that it is the intended meaning and that it is not impossible for Allah. So he says the greatest calamity is to believe in the Quran and Sunnah according to the apparent meaning of the text. He says this is the belief of the corporealists, those who believe in tajsim, who believe that Allah is a body or things of that nature. Astaghfirullah. The idol worshippers whose hearts are deviant and their deviance leads them to follow ambiguous texts seeking discord. May the curses of Allah be upon them one after another. How bold they are in lying and how little they understand the facts. So what is as-Subki saying? Oh yeah, this is just a minor ikhtilafi matter. You guys can interpret the Quran and Sunnah based on the apparent meaning of the text. We'll make ta'wil. There's no major problem. No, he says this is the greatest calamity to interpret the Quran and Sunnah based upon the apparent meaning. And he says this is the belief of the mujassima, those of tajsim, and it is the belief of the idol worshippers. And then he calls for the curse of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be upon them. So are these minor matters of aqidah, of differences? No, they go into the basics of how we interpret the text. Is it based upon these pseudo-rational principles, which are coming from Greek pagan philosophy and other sources? Or do we understand it in the language of Arabic, in the language and the interpretation of the common Muslims and of the language of Arabic which the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ spoke and which the language of the Quran and Sunnah are actually in? Do we understand it on the basic fundamentals of how the language would have been understood and received at the time of revelation? Or do we understand it upon these pseudo-rational principles? He says, if you understand it upon the apparent meaning, this is the greatest calamity, and may the curse of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be upon you. So are we seeing this kumbaya from the Ash'aris and Maturidis of the past? As-Subki, a major scholar, is saying, no, this is the position of the idol worshippers to understand the Quran and Sunnah upon the apparent meaning of the text. Furthermore, As-Subki, the same scholar, says they are a group speaking about the Hashawiyah, which is a derogatory term. He goes on to describe who are the Hashawiyah. He says they are a group who have deviated from the correct path and whose vision has become blinded. They interpret the verses of attributes on their apparent meaning and believe that this is the intended meaning. So the Hashawiyah are those who interpret the Quran and Sunnah upon their apparent meaning. That's why many of the scholars of the Mutakallimun have disrespected the scholars of Hadith. They call them the Hashawiyah, and we'll see that in specific examples, we see how they label them. Now, we'll see the great Maliki scholar, Ibn Abdul Bar, he says what? He affirms that us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah are unanimous upon affirming the attributes mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah upon their apparent meaning. So, who are the Hashawiyah? According to as-Subki, who are those who he's calling a curse upon? Those who affirm the Quran and Sunnah upon the apparent meaning. Now, Ibn Abdul Bar, he says that us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah have ijma' on the fact that we affirm it in that way. He says, us-Sunnah are unanimous in affirming all the attributes mentioned in the Quran wa Sunnah and believing in them and understanding them literally based upon their haqiqi meaning, not metaphorically. However, they do not assign any specific modality, meaning we make tafweed of the kayf, tafweed al-kayfiyah, to these attributes or limit them to a specific description. As for the people of innovation, the Jahmiyyah, the Mu'tazila, in all their forms, and the Khawarij, they all deny these attributes and do not accept them literally or upon their haqiqah, upon their apparent meaning or the reality of what they actually present themselves as. So us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah are those who unanimously affirm the text of the Quran and Sunnah that speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon their apparent meaning. And as-Subki says, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala curse them, and that this is the greatest deviance. So these are fundamental differences, my friends. Some people will say, hold on a second, Jake, but that's just a difference between ta'wil and affirming the text upon their apparent meaning, although this is a general principle. Even those who made tafweed, and some people don't know this, that tafweed is actually tafweed al-ma'na, not tafweed al-kayfiyah, because you have tafweed al-ma'na, which is basically to say, oh, we don't know the meaning of the texts. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says he has a yad, so yad Allah, the hand of Allah, we have no idea what it even means, right? It's just as equivalent of saying, blah, 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 blah. There's no difference. We don't know what it means really at all. We can just say what it doesn't mean. And this is a type of ta'wil because it's basically making ta'wil away from the apparent meaning and saying it's not that, but we don't know what it actually means. It's not just my understanding. Even scholars like al-Bajuri says this, affirming tafweed and saying that it is basically a type of ta'wil. And he says the exact opposite of Imam Ibn Abdul Bar. He says what? By tafweed, or consigning the meaning, delegating or relegating the meaning only to Allah and saying nobody knows what it means, what is meant is to divert the wording from its apparent meaning without attempting to specify the intended meaning. So now he's quoting the previous guy that we just mentioned, Imam as-Subki, said what? The Salaf and the Khalaf have unanimously agreed to make ta'wil of the ambiguous verses in a general sense by diverting the wording from its apparent meaning, which is impossible for Allah due to the conclusive evidence that he is unlike created beings. So on the one hand, we have Imam Ibn Abdul Bar saying that there's ijma' on the fact that us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, the Salaf, actually understood the Quran and Sunnah upon its apparent meaning. And then we have scholars like al-Bajuri and we have people like as-Subki saying, no, it's the exact opposite. The Salaf and the Khalaf have made ta'wil and are unanimously accepting ta'wil, right? And not accepting the Quran and Sunnah upon their apparent meanings. So we see a clear difference here. Not only that, and what you'll see continuously throughout the Ash'aris, and that's why we can't call them all necessarily deviants or even to going to the level of making takfir, because even within Ash'ari and Maturidi creed, there's significant differences between them. And you'll see even on this point that Imam al-Ghazali contradicts as-Subki's claim of consensus of the Salaf making ta'wil. And he gives an example of Imam Ahmed, and he says that Imam Ahmed only made ta'wil over 3 issues, which I'll explain is really not ta'wil in the way that the Ash'aris and Maturidis understand it. And that he said, well, he didn't go far enough, and basically implies that Imam Ahmed did not understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being above the throne or his aboveness in the same way as the Ash'aris and Maturidis. So al-Ghazali says, the Hanbali is compelled to acknowledge ta'wil, as I have heard reliable scholars among the Hanbalis in Baghdad say that Ahmad ibn Hanbal, may Allah have mercy on him, explicitly made ta'wil of only 3 hadiths. So he says, oh, the Hanabila must accept ta'wil because they at least admit that Imam Ahmed made ta'wil of 3 ahadith. The first is the saying of the Prophet, peace be upon him, the black stone is the right hand of Allah on earth. The second is his saying, the heart of the believer is between 2 fingers of the most merciful. The third is his saying, I sense the breath of the most merciful coming from the direction of Yemen. And then al-Ghazali says, observe now how he made ta'wil of these hadiths when it became evident to him that their literal meaning was impossible. That's what the claim is. No, we say that is the literal meaning, but the literal meaning is known contextually. So the understanding that the black stone is the yad of Allah, we understand that text not just based on that hadith, and the entire context of the Quran and Sunnah. So the apparent meaning of that is that, no, Allah's hand isn't like somewhere actually in Mecca, disconnected from the rest of his attributes. No, the apparent meaning is not that. So the apparent meaning is what some Ash'aris are claiming is ta'wil. So there is really a difference in terms of understanding how we understand even what ta'wil is in that context. But nevertheless, let's grant it to him for the sake of argument. Ahmad ibn Hanbal, may Allah be pleased with him, only interpreted these 3 hadiths because the impossibility of their literal meaning became apparent to him only to this extent, for he was not deeply engaged in rational inquiry. Had he delved deeply, it would have also become apparent to him regarding the attribute of aboveness and other aspects that he did not make ta'wil of or he did not interpret. So Imam al-Ghazali is saying, okay, Imam Ahmed, you made good ta'wil on these 3 ahadith, but you didn't go far enough. You didn't make ta'wil of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's aboveness. In other words, what is he saying? He's saying that Imam Ahmed understood that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was outside of creation, was above the world, was above the 7 heavens, was above his throne. He understood that in a literal sense, not in a sense of making ta'wil. So Imam al-Ghazali is admitting this and saying, oh, but it was due to Imam Ahmed's deficiencies in rational inquiry, and he didn't go far enough in these lengths of making ta'wil. So again, this is a criticism of Imam Ahmed. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy upon him, which we don't agree with the criticism, but nevertheless, it's meant to show that he's admitting, contrary to as-Subki, that Imam Ahmed did not make tafweed, did not make ta'wil of the attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's highness or aboveness, being above or outside the world. He didn't make ta'wil of this. He didn't make tafweed of this. He understood it upon its apparent meaning, which contradicts as-Subki's claim that there is ijma' from the Salaf and the Khalaf that no, they diverted from the apparent meaning. No, Imam al-Ghazali is saying that Imam Ahmed did not divert from the apparent meaning, did not make ta'wil, and that he should have. So it's very clear. It's not only the scholars of the past making these accusations against Imam Ahmed or the Hanabila. Saeed Fawda, who is a very popular Ash'ari scholar today, what does he say about the Hanabila? What does he say about the Hanbalis? He says that they're anthropomorphous. He puts them into different categories, but he says that both are anthropomorphous. He says, and I quote, "Do not think, dear reader, that all Hanbalis are anthropomorphous." But then he goes on to say, rather, there are among them anthropomorphous like Qadi Abu Ya'la, Ibn Qudama, and their anthropomorphism is less severe than that of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim and others. So he says, look, the Hanabila, generally speaking, are anthropomorphous. So even Ibn Qudama, those people want to say, oh, Ibn Qudama did tafweed, and the Ash'aris want to say, oh, there's not major significance between us and Ibn Qudama, the aqidah of him as an athari. Saeed Fawda is saying, no, he's calling him an anthropomorphist. It's the same thing with Qadi Abu Ya'la. But then he says, the anthropomorphism of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim are worse. Now, these sound like just minor differences between the Hanafis and Malikis and the Shafi'is and Hanbalis. No, on both sides, from the Atharis and from the Mutakallimun, the Ash'aris and Maturidis, the scholars don't understand it that way, right? We'll see Imam Ahmed was criticized by al-Ghazali, but this is something common from the Mutakallimun. They have no problem actually disrespecting the scholars of Hadith, including Imam al-Bukhari and Muslim. Arazi criticizes Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim here when he says, "It is widely known among the community that a group of heretics fabricated outrageous reports and managed to circulate them among the scholars of Hadith. Due to the purity of their hearts, the Hadith scholars did not recognize these fabrications and accepted them. What could be more outrageous than attributing to Allah descriptions that undermine His divinity and negate His lordship? It is therefore necessary to definitively declare such reports as fabricated." So they reject many authentic Hadith because it goes against their creed. As for Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim, they were not all-knowing. Okay, fair enough. They exerted effort and took precautions to the best of their abilities. To believe that they were aware of all events from the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam until our time is irrational. At most, we hold a favorable opinion of them and those they narrated from. So at most, we hold that a favorable opinion of them. Of course, we don't take their aqidah, which we'll see. However, if we encounter a report containing something absurd that cannot possibly be attributed to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, we must conclude that it is fabricated by heretics and spread among the scholars of Hadith. Fourthly, these Hadith scholars would reject narrations for the slightest reasons. Some inclined towards the love of Imam Ali was considered a Rafidi, so his narration was not accepted. He's criticizing, that they would not accept narrations from a Rafidi, but they would accept narrations that clearly contradict reason and go against the established pseudo-principles of the Greeks, so we must reject these fabricated hadiths and so on and so forth. However, none of them would rationally say that a person who attributes to Allah what negates His divinity and lordship should have his narrations rejected. This is truly astonishing. So he's criticizing Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim for accepting a hadith which clearly negate Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's divinity and lordship, but yet not accepting hadith from the Shia. This is what they do. They're criticizing the scholars of hadith because they know that their aqidah and what their hadith contain go against what they actually believe. So we see very clear differences represented from both sides on methodology and how we interpret scripture and how this could have a ripple effect even to problems that we have today. Now, is this only amongst the scholars, this discussion? And as I showed why the Ash'aris and Maturidis think that these discussions are so important for them to go in detail and trying to prove the existence of God through their methods and so on and so forth, where we believe that people are upon the fitrah in our position. Let's see what as-Sanusi says about the lay people. What do the lay people believe? Because many people criticize and say, hold on a second, Brother Jake. The Hanafis are generally Maturidis, the Malikis and Shafi'is are generally Ash'aris, and so because of that, at least 3/4 or more of the Ummah today are actually Ash'aris or Maturidis. They're not Salafis or Athadis, Jake. It's only some of the Hanabila, and then they'll even go into, this idea of the Neo-Hanabila. Oh, they just made tafweed and all this other nonsense, which isn't true, tafweed al-mana. But nevertheless, they say, oh, the majority of the Ummah today is actually Ash'ari and Maturidi. So how can you criticize so many people, and how can you call them kuffar and deviants? First of all, I'm not even doing that. I'm saying that the aqidah of the Ash'aris and Maturidis is bid'ah, is deviant. It is a deviant aqidah. I'm saying that very clearly. But likewise, look at what as-Subki said about us and our aqidah. Those who affirm the Quran and Sunnah upon the apparent meaning, it says, may Allah curse them. It's from both sides. And I'm not therefore criticizing as-Subki because of that. He actually genuinely believes that, and he should believe that if he actually believes the nonsense that he's spewing, that we shouldn't actually affirm the aqidah of the Quran and Sunnah upon the apparent meaning. This is where it should be, because both sides recognize that these are huge fundamental issues. They're not somewhere out on the outskirts. No. So what does as-Sanusi say? Does he say that the majority of the lay people are actually Ash'aris and Maturidis? Or no? He doesn't mention Athadis or Salafis because many people say, oh, Jake, most of the lay people never even heard of Ash'ari, Maturidi, or Salafi or Athadi, and even if they have, they couldn't explain to you the differences. I fully grant that for the sake of argument, but that's not the point. What do they actually believe? Are their beliefs in line with the Ash'aris and Maturidis and the Mutakallimun? Or are their beliefs in line with al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, generally speaking? We say their beliefs are generally in line because they're upon the fitrah, unless they're deviated by the Mutakallimun or the Mutafalsifa and these kind of people. They are upon the fitrah, and therefore they actually believe the Quran and Sunnah upon its apparent meaning and affirm the same beliefs that we have. So even the Ash'aris and Maturidis admit this. They don't make the claim that the awam or the general laity are upon their beliefs. That's why they find it so important to stress teaching them these deviant things. As-Sanusi says, most lay people exhibit a lack of engagement with scholarly gatherings and interactions with pious individuals. This leads to a prevalence of erroneous theological concepts. So most lay people have deviant beliefs. And what are those deviant beliefs? Including anthropomorphism or tajsim, assigning directionality to God, so they saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above the thrones and pointing to that direction, as we know of the famous hadith of the slave girl doing this in front of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, and him approving of this. And as al-Ghazali admits, was the position of Imam Ahmad, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was separate and outside of creation and above creation. This was the position of the Salaf. This was the position of Imam Ahmad, as Imam al-Ghazali admits. And so affirming directionality, saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is above the throne and being able to point towards him. The attribution of events to natural causes, meaning affirming secondary causation. Now don't think, oh, this is so technical terminology. All it means is, which the Ash'aris who are occasionalists deny, that when I type on my computer screen, does a common person actually believe that Jake is pressing these buttons and that when he does so, he's at least in part a cause of the words appearing on the screen? Of course, this is how the common person understands it. But the Ash'aris say, no. You have no causal power whatsoever. You have no quwwah. You have no power whatsoever to actually make those letters appear upon the screen or anything else that happens. It's just Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creating it at that exact time, and you are not actually genuinely doing anything. The action is just ascribed to you, but you're not actually genuinely doing anything at that particular moment in time. It's all Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is the only agent in the world. And there are significant consequences to that when it comes to morality, but I'm not even going to go into that in depth right now. Because if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only agent, is the only one that's doing anything, then theoretically, we would attribute all sorts of types of things to him. Murder, rape, astaghfirullah, because he's the only agent. So the action is his. He's the only one doing anything genuinely. How do they acquire the action when they don't even have any power to perform the action? They're not even doing anything genuinely. And again, I'm not saying that the Ash'aris and Maturidis would accept that lazim, but in reality, actually is a genuine entailment of their position. So of course, the layperson says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is genuinely above the throne. And as Ghazali said, Imam Ahmad held the same position, that we believe in human beings are able to move and actually do things, and the belief that God's actions are purposeful. Many times, and what's going on, and this is significant, so people who say there is no significance to these disputes whatsoever, we say, as Athariya of the Salafis, we say, of al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does things for his own perfect hikmah, or his own perfect wisdoms. He has a wisdom behind why he does everything that he actually does. The Ash'aris say no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't do anything for reasons. To affirm that he does things for reasons would negate his will. He doesn't do anything genuinely for reasons. We say no, he does do do things for reasons. He has a hikmah for why he's doing everything and allowing everything to happen, including the atrocities that are occurring in Palestine right now, including all of the oppression that is happening to the Muslims. We seek for an answer. The common Muslim seeks for an answer, seeks for a greater wisdom in their own lives about their trials and tribulations that they're going through. Not that we can always understand what those wisdoms are. We may never understand them until the next life or until 20 years later down in our own life, but nevertheless, we trust that there is a wisdom to why these things are happening. This is one of the wisdoms of the story of Al-Khidr and Musa alayhi salam, where Musa alayhi salam could not understand the wisdoms behind some of the things that were happening until it was explained to him, because he didn't have the knowledge on those issues. But what we understand from that is we have to know and trust that there is always a hikmah behind what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is doing and allowing to happen. But the Ash'aris say, no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not do anything for any reason whatsoever. Now you tell me, any Muslim that you go on the street and you ask, even in English there's this phrase, everything happens for a reason. We believe this. Everything happens for a reason. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a reason for everything that he's doing. But the Ash'aris reject ta'leel. And there are issues that even come up with this when it comes to the Maturidis, who accept, at least in one sense, ta'leel. And they came down very harsh on the Ash'aris for rejecting this, because it winds up a negation of prophethood, which we'll see in just a second. What are some of the other beliefs? The belief that God's actions are purposeful, that he has a purpose or reason for his actions, and the misconception that his speech is composed of harf wa sawt, letters and sounds, which again is the position of the Ethidis. Sometimes he speaks and sometimes he's silent, right? This is affirming sifat al-ikhtiyariyah, the position that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's actions, he can do something and then do something else. He can speak to Musa alayhi salam and then stop speaking to Musa alayhi salam. He can create one thing and then create something else. The Ash'aris reject this. They say that he cannot speak and then remain silent, because if he did this, then this would be an accident in his essence, and anything that has accidents in its essence, it itself must be hadith, it itself must be makhluk, it must be created, and so on and so forth. These are all of the entailments that they make on this. So if you read the Quran and you said genuinely, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke to Musa alayhi salam, had a conversation, then stopped speaking to him, that he will create something in the future, that he will speak to us on the day of judgment. If you believe everything in this apparent meaning of the text, then you have a deviant or kufri belief according to the Ash'aris and Maturidis, which is how the common lay people understand the text. He says that if you understand that Allah speaks and it sometimes is silent, like human speech, these notions align with the doctrines of the people of falsehood. Who is he talking about? Obviously, us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, although he wouldn't use that term. Significantly, some of these beliefs have been condemned as kufr or disbelief by the ijma' of the scholars. So the lay people do not believe what the mutakallimun believe, what the Ash'aris and Maturidis believe. If you look at this belief of affirming that Allah is above the throne, genuinely, which is the position of Imam Ahmad, as Ghazali admits, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala acts for a reason, that we genuinely have a quwwah or power to operate in the universe, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks with letters and sounds, that sometimes he speaks and sometimes he's silent. All of these positions are the positions of Ahl al-Hadith, of the scholars of Hadith, of Ahl al-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So who are the lay people upon? What beliefs are they upon, generally speaking? They're upon the fitrah. They're upon what the Quran and Sunnah say upon the apparent meaning. That's why we don't need to teach them these sort of intricate matters that the mutakallimun are spewing and going into, but they need to, because they know that they're not upon their beliefs. Now, I have an entire article on this subject where I give more quotes and references and go in more in detail, and a link to that will be in the description of this video. Now, Ibn Taymiyyah speaks about one of these beliefs, this occasionalism where they reject that human beings have any causal influence in the world or are doing anything genuinely in the world. He says some scholars like Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari and those who followed him from the scholars of Malik and Shafi'i and even Ahmed, some of them, among others, have denied powers or quwwah and natures. They've denied natures or powers in the world. These individuals and groups have denied powers and natures and have denied also causality. They deny causality in the world. Instead, they claim that God acts in those occasions, but not through those causes, i.e. occasionalism. They therefore claim that God does not satiate an individual through bread, nor quench an individual's thirst through water, nor bring forth vegetation through water. Rather, they claim that he acts at those occasions, but not through those causes. causes. So if you think that water genuinely quenches your thirst, or that food genuinely satiates your body and your stomach, then you don't believe what the Ash'aris believe, which is just a wild idea that people wouldn't even think of. These individuals and groups have contradicted the scripture, have contradicted the Sunnah, and have contradicted the consensus of the Salaf as-Salih, in addition to contradicting clear reason and sense. So it's not only that they contradict scripture and revelation and what the Salaf said, they contradict clear reason, because nobody would think of this. That's why I don't like when even some Salafis or Ethidis say, oh, they're too much about reason. No, they're about pseudo-rational principles that contradict the sound reason and fitrah. Why? Since God has stated in his book, and he it is who sendeth the winds as tidings, heralding his mercy, till when they bear a cloud heavy with rain, we lead it to a dead land, and then cause water to descend thereon, and thereby bring forth fruits of every kind. Thus bring we forth the dead, happily ye may remember. Thus God informed us that he brings down rain by means of the clouds, and brings forth vegetation through this rainwater. Finally, people know by virtue of their senses and reason that some things are causes for effects, just as they know that being satiated results from eating, not solely by preparing food and from eating food, not by eating pebbles. Meaning, how are you actually satiated from food? It's not by eating pebbles, it's by eating food, because there's something different in the food than pebbles that actually helps to satiate. And they know that water is an essential cause for the life of animals and plants. God said, and we made every living thing of water. Animals are only quenched by drinking water, not by walking to get water. There are many other examples of this. So Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah is pointing out the silliness. Animals, they don't quench their thirst by just walking to the river. They actually have to drink it. And that's because the water actually has some effect in quenching their thirst. Ibn Taymiyyah also provides similar examples in another passage, right? Not only about there being genuine causes or secondary causes in the world, that there are actual things that are happening that have an effect on other things, rather than just God doing things like puppeteer controlling puppets or something like that, where Ibn Taymiyyah says, and I quote, "Now some say causes among which are the servant's ability created by God, exalted is he, are not truly causes. In fact, it makes no difference whether they exist or not. They are only associated with one another like evidence for a supposition. Those who opine in such a manner denied the causes and wise purposes and reasons that God has imbued in his creation and commandments. It is like saying that a cheek can see like the eye, or that the one spiritual heart does not have any greater ability to understand the religion more than one's leg, or that dirt can burn just like fire. They also reject the natural disposition of bodies. Some sages have said that those who have denied causes, powers, and natures are susceptible to the ridicule of those who are rational. The other group denied that individuals carry out their actions, that they have power to have an effect, that they are causes for anything, or that God has created entities for wise purposes. These were all denied by who? The Jahmis and those Jabris who followed him, although many of them claim to be followers of al-Sunnah. So many claim to be al-Sunnah, but they're not al-Sunnah. If you accept this position that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't act for reasons or for perfect hikmah or wisdom, then you're not part of al-Sunnah if you're not understanding it appropriately in that way. Likewise, the same way if you're not affirming secondary causation in the world. I wrote a text which is called the Ash'ari and the Problems of Proving Prophethood from the Ash'aris and the Philosophers, again, which will be linked in the description of this video, where I go into much more detail on this matter. But the Maturidis have enough sense to reject the Ash'ari position of them rejecting ta'leel or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doing things for no reason at all. The Maturidi scholar Shamsuddin al-Samarqandi says what? Commenting on the Ash'ari position of rejecting ta'leel, says, actions in this way do not contradict God's absolute perfection. In fact, they are the very essence of it, meaning he can't be perfect without acting for perfect reasons. The opposite would be a sign of deficiency and purposelessness. Consider the mission of the prophets. Their purpose is to guide humanity and serve as a proof or hujjah against them. Miracles are manifested to confirm their truthfulness. Therefore, whoever denies the existence of ta'leel, or Allah acting for reasons, for God's actions effectively denies prophethood itself and their their arguments invalidate prophethood. So he's basically saying if you reject that Allah acts for reasons, then you could not say that he sent a prophet for the reason of helping to guide humanity, and therefore it winds up in a negation of prophethood, which is obviously kufr. So when they say, oh, well, what about the 6 pillars of Iman? One of them is affirming the prophets, right? Oh, okay. Well, then if we agree on that, then, oh, it's no problem. No, because their rejection of Allah acting for genuine, perfect wisdoms and reasons actually winds up in entailing of rejecting of prophethood. It's a very dangerous belief to say that Allah acts for no reason whatsoever. And even the Maturidis are basically accusing the Ash'aris of a kufri position. Furthermore, Ibn Taymiyyah explains more generally the Ash'ari position on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's actions. Their belief on Allah's actions is the same exact reason why they believe the Arabic Quran is created, which I've went over, and again, I'll link to a video in the description of this video where I go into more detail on this. It's the same reason why they say that Allah cannot speak and then stop speaking, because if he does that, then he would be in time and then he would not be God, and so on and so forth. All this other nonsense. Note that, as I said, as-Sunnah claims the lay people believe that Allah can speak and remain silent whenever he wills, meaning he speaks by his will and power, which is the position of us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. As I said, I have a video on this topic, which will be in the description. However, the Ash'ari position is actually the position of the Jahmiyyah, according to Imam al-Bukhari and the people of knowledge. I have an article on that discussion, which again, I'll put in the description of this video. Ibn Taymiyyah says, according to him, meaning al-Ash'ari, and those who denied that volitional actions can be ascribed to Allah's essence, the meaning is that he creates certain states or phenomena in some of his creations and calls them descent, just as he said that he creates in the throne a meaning which he calls istiwa, establishment. For the Ash'ari, this means drawing the throne closer to himself without any action occurring within him. He considers Allah's inherent actions like descent and istiwa to be like his transitive actions, such as creation and beneficence, all of which, according to him, are effects that are separate from him. What are they basically saying? That none of Allah's actions subsist genuinely with his essence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have attributes of actions that subsist with his essence. So when he creates, there is no action that subsists with him that is an act of creation. No, not at all. In fact, they say that the fi'l is the same thing as the maf'ul, meaning the act of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the same thing as a thing which is acted upon, or the effect of the action. Now, anybody who knows basic Arabic knows that this contradicts Arabic to say that the fi'l is the same thing as the maf'ul. No, they're two different things. Even the structure of Arabic grammar assumes this. The entire Quran and Sunnah assume this grammatical structure, that the act of a subject is distinct from the effect. The one who says that the act and the effect are the same thing, according to Imam al-Bukhari, is the position of the Jahmiyyah, which then later became the position of the Ash'aris. So they reject all of Allah's attributes of action. A lot of people make a big to-do about Yad Allah, and rightly so, how the Ash'aris negate many of those other attributes, like Allah's face and hand and so on and so forth. However, they also reject basic things like Allah's act of creating being a genuine attribute of his, or an act of judgment, or so on and so forth. Anything that has to do with actions, and this is why a consequence of this is that they must reject that Allah actually spoke the Arabic Quran. Because if he spoke Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim before he said Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, then this would mean he spoke and then was silent, and then anything that speaks and is silent, it itself must be created, because of their whole argument for Huduth al-Ijsam, and that's how they establish supposedly the existence of the Creator, which we reject the argument in the way that they've put it forward. And they say that the layman must actually accept these types of arguments in order to be justified in their belief in God. We say, no, your argument actually goes against the Quran and Sunnah, and the layman already rejects it, which you already are admitting. Going into now this issue of the Quran being created, al-Jurjani openly admits that the Ash'aris, and it's not only him, there are many have said this, openly admits that the Ash'aris agree that the Arabic Quran is created. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cannot actually speak as an action. That's why when I accuse the Ash'aris of their likening Allah to actually the idols because they cannot speak, they said, oh, Jake, you're misrepresenting. No, in terms of an action that subsists with Allah's essence, he does not speak because he can't speak and then remain silent. He doesn't have the genuine quwwah or power to do so, according to the Ash'aris. Now, al-Jurjani admits that the Ash'aris agree that the Arabic Quran is created. The debate is only on kalam nafsi, nafsi, and whether it is the speech of Allah or it is reduced to ilm and irada or will. He says, Jorjani says, know that what the Mu'tazila say about the speech of Allah, namely that it consists of created sounds and letters indicating intended meanings, and that these are occurrences existing apart from His essence, is something we agree upon. There is no dispute between us and them on this matter. However, what we assert and affirm is an internal speech, which is distinct from other attributes, which is something they deny. Even if they were to acknowledge it, they would not deny its eternal nature, which we claim for His speech. Thus, the point of contention between us and them lies in their denial or affirmation of this internal meaning. Basically, the Mu'tazila and the Ash'aris and Maturidis agree that the Arabic Quran is created because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala never actually spoke it as an act. He just creates letters and sounds in created bodies, and then they say that's somehow Him speaking, which, as I said, doesn't make any sense, and I have a video detailing that in the description of this video. The only difference is whether they actually affirm the sifa of kalam nafsi. It's called kalam, or it's called speech, but is not made up of letters of sounds, is this undifferentiated meaning that is eternal, and nobody really understands what it is, right? That's basically the Ash'ari position. Whereas us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah say that no, we say Allah speaks with letters and sounds, and He speaks by His will and His power, which is the same thing that as-Sunusi says that the general laity believe. So the general laity are not on the position of the Ash'aris and the Maturidis. Okay. Now, when it comes to this issue of kalam nafsi, even that al-Jorjani is hinting at the fact that the Mu'tazila don't have a hard time affirming it. They just reduce it to ilm, or the will of Allah. That's all. But they don't consider it a distinct attribute, but in terms of substance, they agree on the content of the belief. Now, related to this, what is the position of Ahl al-Hadith? Imam al-Bukhari narrates a hadith which says, Allah will say, "O Adam," and He will respond, "At your service and your pleasure." Then Allah will call out with a voice, "Allah commands you to bring forth from your progeny those destined for hellfire." Now, based upon this hadith and other hadith, Imam al-Bukhari has the position what? That of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks by His will and power. Sometimes He speaks, sometimes He's silent. He says something, then Adam responds. Then Allah responds to him. And that also Allah speaks with a voice. He speaks with harf wa sawt, letters and sounds, and with a voice that can be heard. Okay. Now, does this mean that we believe, astaghfirullah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a mouth like us and that He resembles created beings? No, of course, we still affirm laysa kamithlihi shay. Not at all. So Imam al-Bukhari states what? And that Allah Almighty calls out with a voice that is heard by those far away as clearly by those near. This is unique to Allah, glorified be His mention. So very clearly, Imam al-Bukhari is affirming a voice for Allah because He speaks by letters and sounds. But then he says, again, Imam al-Bukhari says, this is evidence that Allah's voice is unlike the voices of creation. For His voice, glorified be His mention, is heard equally from afar as from near, and the angels are overcome by it. So he's given an example of the differences between the voice of Allah and the voices of creation. Allah's voice can be heard from near and far at the same level. That is not the same thing with creation. But he's still affirming a voice for Allah, and that He speaks by letters and sounds, and by His will He can speak to Adam alayhi salam. Adam responds, and there's a conversation back and forth, which is the clear apparent meaning of the text. Now, Imam Ahmad's son, referencing his father, says this: I asked my father about people who say that when Allah spoke to Moses, He did not speak with a voice. My father replied, yes, He spoke with a voice. We narrate these ahadith as they have come. When Allah speaks, a sound is heard, like the dragging of a chain over stone. My father said, these Jahmiyyah deny this. He added, these people are disbelievers. They seek to deceive the people. Whoever claims that Allah did not speak is a disbeliever. So the entailment of the Ash'ari view and the Maturidi view is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not actually speak, because there is no voice or sound that is emitted from Him. He does not actually speak. And Imam Ahmad, according to his son, narrated by his son, considers these people to be kuffar, considers these people, generally speaking, to be disbelievers. Now, I don't want people to misconstrue this and say, oh, look, Jake is making takfir of all of the Ash'aris and Maturidis. No, that's not my point. That's to show you how fundamental the ulama of the past actually considered these issues. And they are important because they go all the way back to the fundamentals. How do we understand the Quran and Sunnah? Is it upon its apparent meaning, or is it this batini meaning where there's an inner meaning and an outer meaning, and we have to make ta'wil because the apparent meaning of the text is kufr and the lay people are upon that and all this kind of nonsense? And then the Ash'aris and Maturidis actually say that the reason was because the lay people basically wouldn't understand it. So he had to reveal it upon the apparent meaning, which is kufri, but the scholars come along to let people know, okay, this is not how it's understood. Basically, they wouldn't accept the Quran and Sunnah if he revealed it in the manner of how it would correctly appear on its apparent meaning according to the mutakallimun. So that's one issue when it comes to sifat al-ikhtiyariya, or the attributes of action, and does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala act for reasons, and is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala above the throne, and is there genuine power or secondary causation in the world. Here's another example on the issue of iman. How do we understand what iman actually is? Now this is a hotly contested issue, but as-Subki has enough honesty to actually admit that the Ash'aris do not uphold the position of the Salaf in the discussion of Iman. As-Subki says the madhab of al-Ash'ari and most of his followers is that Iman is merely affirmation. However, there is a difference of opinion regarding the meaning of affirmation. Is it knowledge, or is it the assertion of the self with certainty, which inherently includes knowledge? Al-Baqalani favored this latter view. The madhab of the Salaf is that Iman is knowledge in the heart, acknowledgement by the tongue, and action by the limbs, increasing and decreasing and not ceasing with the absence of actions. In this matter, the madhab of the Salaf is the truth, and its explanation belongs in a different context. As Subki is saying, is our position, is the position of the Atharis, that what? Iman is acknowledged, or knowledge in the heart, is on the tongues, is also based upon the actions of the limbs, and that it goes up and down, that Iman can go up and down based upon your piety and whether or not you're performing good or bad actions. As-Subki notes that this is not the position of Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari and the position of Ash'aris generally speaking, but it is the position of the Salaf, which is our position. Some people may say, oh, well, Jake, this is not really a big deal, but it is a big deal because it relates to the position of Irja, which is basically saying, you know, these people that go around and say, oh, well, we don't know, or we can't know what he actually believes because, you know, belief or Iman is only in the heart. No, Iman also relates to the person's actions. So we can see and we can judge and we can ask him questions, and it's based on what he says and his actions to whether or not he actually has Iman or has strong or Iman or weak Iman. So this actually can fall into or relate to the position of Irja, which is a deviant position, that Iman is basically only in the heart. You know, this sort of Care Bear understanding of how faith works. We don't have that understanding. On the one hand, as you know, you see these conflicts even amongst the Ash'aris themselves. As-Subki says that this is the position of the Salaf, which is the position of the Atharis, and contradicts Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari. But Al-Amadi, another Ash'ari scholar, says that this is the position of the Hashawiyya, which is a derogatory term, and which is the position of Imam al-Bukhari himself, which we'll see in just a second. Al-Amadi says, thus the invalidity of the Hashawiyya assertion is established, that Iman is belief in the heart, verbal affirmation, and action with the limbs. So the Hashawiyya believe that Iman is belief in the heart, verbal affirmation, and action upon the limbs. Now remember, Hashawiyya is a derogatory term. Now who believes that? Imam al-Bukhari says, I met more than 1,000 scholars across various regions and did not see anyone differing on the fact that Iman consists of speech and action, and that it increases and decreases. So Imam al-Bukhari, he's one of the greatest scholars of our ummah, greatest scholars of the Salaf, who the Ash'aris and Maturidis would want to generally affirm, but we'll see some of them actually explicitly throw him under the bus and mock him. But generally speaking, the Ash'aris and Maturidis don't want to do this. He says he met over 1,000 scholars of his time, and they affirmed the position of Iman according to what we're upon, not according to what As-Subki says the Ash'aris are upon. So As-Subki is correct in stating that that is the position of the Salaf, and Imam al-Bukhari is one of them. We have people like Muhammad Zahid Hassan al-Kawthari, who explicitly mocks Imam al-Bukhari. So we just saw the quote from Imam al-Bukhari. Now he says this, and I quote, strangely, who was a Maturidi, some consider one of their leaders in Hadith. Oh wait, he's not your leader in Hadith? Imam al-Bukhari is not your leader in Hadith? Okay. Strangely, some consider one of their leaders in Hadith to be saying proudly, I did not include in my book anyone who does not consider Iman to be composed of speech and action, which which increases and decreases, despite including extremists among the Khawarij and others. So just like Arazi earlier was upset because Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim did not take narrations, supposedly according to him, from the deviant Shia, but he did accept narrations that went against his pseudo-rational principles. Al-Kawthari here is saying, and this is referring to Imam al-Bukhari very clearly, that he did not take a hadith from people who did not have the same position on Iman as he did. So again, they're mocking and ridiculing the scholars of hadith. I've given a lot of information and I can go into more details and more differences, but I want to address one issue because there are some people who are claiming that, okay, Jake, you brought up a point, you've shown very clearly these are fundamental differences, how they are relevant to the ummah today and in the past, how the scholars of the ummah from both sides of the Salafis, Atharis, and the Mutakallimun and the Ash'aris and Maturidis on the other side, how they did consider them fundamental issues, how they even went to cursing each other, which I'm not saying that we necessarily need to do, but that was the position of as-Subki, and labeling their creeds deviant and so on and so forth. This was the standard position. But Jake, there are a minority of people, even amongst the Hanabila, who disagreed, especially the later Hanbalis. And one example that they love to use is Imam as-Safarini. And he is a scholar from amongst the later Hanbalis. And they always go to him to say, oh, but Jake, he includes the Ash'aris and Maturidis amongst us-Sunnah. Now, that is somewhat true, but they're not telling you the full story. He explicitly, when going over the hadith of the 73 sects, says there's only one that it is, and it's not the sect of the Ash'aris, Maturidis, and Atharis. It only applies to al-Athariyah. In the same text that they used, just a few pages or so later, the same exact text that they used to try to establish that Imam as-Safarini had their position, where Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah are all three sects, Atharis, Maturidis, and Ash'aris. He says what? Some scholars have said they, meaning the saved sect, are the people of Hadith, referring to the Atharis, Ash'aris, and Maturidis. So he's saying some people say that the saved sect of the 73, all three of them are Ahl-Sunnah, and so because of that, they're all three of the saved sect. He says, I said the phrase in the Hadith, except for one sect, contradicts multiplicity. Therefore, I said, and this text without certainty only applies to the Atharis. That is, it does not apply or hold true for any sect among the 73 sects, except for the sect of the people of Athar, the Athariyah. As for the others from the remaining sects, they have ruled by reason and contradicted what was transmitted from the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The obligation is to accept what has been transmitted, so how can the hadith or the athar apply to them? How can this hadith that says that only one sect will be saved apply to the Ash'aris and Maturidis? Of course it doesn't. It only applies to Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah in specific terms, according to as-Safarini, which is al-Athariyah, which is not the Ash'aris and Maturidis. Why? Because they deviated from the text of the Quran and Sunnah. So very clearly he sees them as deviating from the Quran and Sunnah, and therefore they are not actually going to be a part of the saved sect, and they're going to be a part of the deviant sects. And we know that those deviant sects, generally speaking, not necessarily every single individual, but generally speaking, those sects will have to go to the hellfire if they're Muslims, at least for a certain amount of time, and then be excused eventually or be forgiven, then go to Jannah or paradise. Further down in the same text, Imam as-Safarini says, he talks about the people who held the position of the Jahmiyyah on the position of the Quran that I mentioned, just to show you an example of why he doesn't consider them part of the saved sect. So he says, people ridiculed them and directly against the Jahmiyyah and those amongst the Mutakallimun who agreed with them, claiming that the Quran is merely an expression of God's internal speech and that what we have in our mushafs is created. He said, they are its opponents. So what of a group that has abandoned guidance through the foolishness of minds? They made the Quran a metaphor and an expression, something narrated, created, and attributed to man. They claim that the Quran is an expression denoting the eternal internal speech. So the eternal always existed, internal meaning within Allah speech. What is narrated, they're talking about kalam an-nafsi, refers to this expression as they explicitly stated that it is a narration of the eternal speech. As for the revelation sent down to our Master Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they claimed it to be created and temporal, not eternal. They claim that the expression, meaning what was revealed to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, written in the mushafs and mentioned in the hearts, is the saying of a man, meaning that it's not the speech of Allah, it's the speech of the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam. Meaning that the one who expressed the internal meaning through these recited phrases is created. Meaning the Arabic Quran is created. That is the Ash'ari and Maturidi position, which he's going to go on and criticize. Know that Imam Ahmed, he said, was imprisoned, beaten, and tested, as were the other great Imams, because they refused to say that the Quran in the Mus'hafs is created. They stood firm and declared those who held this belief to be disbelievers, as is well known and documented. So he's attributing a kufri belief to the Ash'aris and Maturidis. Those who claim that the Quran is created are of two groups. Some asserted that it is created in both word and meaning. They are the Jahmiyyah, and those who agreed with them. Others said that its words are created, but they are indicative of the internal speech of Allah that exists within His essence. And then he goes on further to say, thus Ibn al-Qayyim, in his famous poem, An-Nunniyah, rebuked the Jahmiyyah and those who agreed with them from the Mu'tazila and the Ash'aris, as well as those who followed in their footsteps in their claim that the Quran is created. So as-Safarini clearly says that the Maturidis and the Ash'aris are not from the saved sect. They're a deviant sects. They're not going to go to immediately to paradise. And that one example of this is because they hold a kufri position on the Quran, where they say that what is in the Mus'haf, what is the Arabic Quran, is makhluk, is created, and this is kufr. This is a kufri position. Again, I'm not using this to make general takfir of the Ash'aris and Maturidis. I'm just showing very clearly that Imam as-Safarini does not have the position that the Ash'aris and some of these fake Hanbalis are attributing to him. Okay, so I just wanted to include that because I know that some people are going to respond and say, oh, but these people said it and this scholar today supposedly said it. We don't care. We're going through our scholars in our tradition who are relied upon, going all the way back and showing that scholars on both sides, from the Mutakallimun and from the Atharis on the other hand, consider these to be fundamental issues in terms of how you interpret the Quran and Sunnah, how we understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's names and attributes. And these are relevant today because they have to do with whether or not you're going to paradise and Jannah or whether or not you will be punished. And they say, oh, well, Jake, you went through so many complicated examples. I think I made it as simple as I can. And I showed that in many things, like, do you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala acts for reasons? Who would say that He does things for no reason at all? This is the position of the Ash'aris. Again, link in the description of this video where I go in detail on that in an article. Do you believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the power to speak and then stop speaking? Of course. He spoke to Musa alayhi salam and then stopped speaking to him. He's not speaking to us now. He will speak to us on the day of judgment. This is the clear understanding of the apparent meaning of the Quran and Sunnah. But you can't believe in that because, according to the Ash'aris, the apparent meaning of the Quran and Sunnah has kufr embedded in it. Why? Because the fitrah which the lay people are on would be attracted to that, and they would not accept the Quran and Sunnah unless it was revealed upon this kufri understanding. So then later scholars, the Mutakallimun, need to come in. They need to make ta'wil of these texts. They need to show us what the real hidden meaning of these texts are, which would not have been understood by the laity or the early scholars of the Ummah. And they need to make ta'wil so that we can show what the real meaning of Scripture is and get it away from this kufri understanding of the lay people. We, on the other hand, the Athari say that the lay people are upon the fitrah, generally speaking. And as-Sanusi explicitly shows that, and the beliefs that he lists are, generally speaking, the beliefs of the Atharis, that Allah speaks by His will, His power. He can speak and then stop speaking. That He speaks with letters and sounds, as Imam al-Bukhari's position is. That He has a voice when He speaks. That He is above His throne, haqiqatan. That He is in reality above His throne, as Imam Ahmed's position was, and the great scholars who followed him and who he took from before that. Why? Because the Quran and Sunnah are very clear, and the position of the Salaf as-Salih is very clear as well. Very, very abundantly clear. To the point where Ghazali admitted that Imam Ahmed did not make ta'wil of this. He understood it in a literal sense. So these are dividing line issues. And up until the point today, they deal with issues related to atheism. How do we respond to the atheists? They bring up this problem of evil. Oh, why is Allah allowing evil in the world? Well, we can respond to that, and we can go into detail about this, right, as Ibn al-Qayyim does, to speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wisdom, his perfect wisdoms in allowing certain things to happen and giving examples of that. But the Ash'aris cannot appeal to that because they don't believe that Allah acts for reasons. Their position also related to that is that, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself, because he doesn't have to have a reason for why he does anything, that he just as easily could have willed for shirk to be halal instead of haram, and that would not have conflicted with his attributes. We say, no. It would have conflicted with his attributes. For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to will for shirk to be halal or for it to be a good thing actually contradicts his perfection and his perfect wisdom. But the Ash'aris don't take that position. They don't say, generally speaking, that it's naqs for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to will that. They don't say that it would be a deficiency for Allah to will that. We say it would be a deficiency for Allah to will that. So their moral theory is this radical divine command theory, which Allah could will, he could just nilly-willy will anything to happen and he doesn't have to have any reason for why he does it. It has terrible consequences in responding to atheists on the problem of evil, in responding to the so-called Euthyphro dilemma, which is, does Allah will things because they're good, right? Or are they good because Allah wills things? We have a way of responding to that, and the Ash'aris just say, oh, they're good only because Allah wills it, and it's completely arbitrary. He could have willed something entirely different and it would have been just as good. We don't believe that. That's not our position. We don't believe that there's no objective difference between Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willing that shirk is haram and willing that shirk is halal. We don't say that there's no objective difference between those. The standard Ash'ari position is there's no objective difference between them, and the difference is only because Allah willed one thing or the other. But he just as easily could have willed the other thing. If he wanted to, just boom, he could have done it, no problem. Meshi mushkil, no difference whatsoever. This is not our position, okay? And then in terms of fiqhi matters, if you have this batiniya approach of the mutakallimun, it can have grave effects on this modernist, liberalist understanding of the Quran and Sunnah. Because if you can make ta'wil of Allah's names and attributes from their apparent meaning of the text to make it seem like it says something entirely different, then of course you can do the same thing with fiqh. So this has serious implications. Now, I'm not saying, and I'm not doing this on my channel, that I need to make every single video based upon always talking about aqidah and bashing the deviants and so on and so forth. But as Shaykh al-Islam ibn Taymiyyah said, it is an important thing. And Imam Ahmed said it's important even than general ibadah for the individual because he's helping the Muslims, which is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to call people back to the aqidah of the Salaf as-Salih and warn against the deviant beliefs. And if people don't want to do that, that's fine, that's their business. But I'm going to do what I want to do. And I want to unite with people upon the Quran and Sunnah, not upon falsehood. Now, again, this does not mean that all of the Ash'aris and Maturidis are kuffar or even deviants, but they are upon a deviant creed, whether they know it or not. And that's why we need to give da'wah to them, inshallah. Likewise, they consider me to be upon a deviant creed. And I accept at least the honesty, but I don't accept the kumbaya mentality from people who are claiming to be Atharis or Hanbalis or Salafis in Aqidah, and those who are claiming to be Ash'aris and Maturidis in Aqidah, who say, no, these are not fundamental differences. Just stick to the 6 pillars of Iman. The 6 pillars of Iman, according to whose understanding? According to the understanding of the Mutakallimun, according to the understanding of us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah, according to the Mu'tazila, according to the philosophers, according to who? We have to go into some detail about this. Now, a lot of people want to say, oh, but we should be uniting on other issues like Palestine and liberalism and secularism. Fine, no problem. We can unite on those. We can even maybe do a conference together or something like that where we speak about these issues, so long as we are abundantly clear what we're upon and that we do not accept their deviant aqidah. And we make that very clear. And we don't get into their traps of being there and, allowing them to spread their falsehood and inject this kind of stuff. I have no problem coming out and saying, I agree with certain people about, yes, the oppression that's happening to the Palestinians. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala liberate them. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala destroy the Zionists. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. I have no problem openly stating this. And I think that us Muslims need to do a lot more into helping them, without a doubt. But I'm not then going to say that and then negate everything else I just said about Aqidah and its importance. So I hope that you guys found this video educational. Yes, it was a long video, but I think it needed to be done. Who is or who are us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah? It is the people of Hadith, it is Ahl al-Hadith, or Salafiyah, or al-Athariyah. That is who is the saved sect. That is who is Ahl-Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And the Ash'aris and Maturidis can be called Sunnis in the sense that they are much closer closer to us, yes, definitely, and we don't takfir their entire groups necessarily, but they are upon deviant aqidas, and it is very serious and will have an effect on this life and the afterlife, into how we respond to shubahat and how we understand the Quran and Sunnah and our status in the afterlife with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is not just my opinion. I will also put a link in the description of this video to Uthman al-Khamis, where he explicitly is basically taking the same position as I am in a much shorter video explaining who the Ash'aris and Maturidis are, that they're closer to us in Aqidah today than any other group. However, they are not upon the same Aqidah and therefore are not us-Sunnah wal Jama'ah in that sense. With that being said, guys, I hope that you found this video educational. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell so you get notified of future videos. Comment, like, subscribe, and share. Share this on your social media platforms. No matter how big or how small your reach is, it really does help with the algorithm, guys. And if you want to go above and beyond and support my channel, then the best two ways to do so are at the two links that are pinned at the top of the description of this video, as well as the comment section of this video. With that being said, guys, until next time, inshallah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.